from Carlyle Group say the things he said about ESG, the millennialization of our society. We take that very, very seriously, and it is a serious thing for our industry. So we spoke earlier about the focus on clients rather than products and customization, and we take this further now with our next panel, entitled Innovation Driving the Client Experience. Here we'll explore core innovations, the rise of artificial intelligence, and putting clients at the very heart of the business. The panel's led by Professor Aman Rajan, the CEO of Create Research, a UK think tank that specializes in the future trends in global fund management. Aman's published numerous books and articles on investment management and is a visiting professor at Exeter University, a fellow at Oxford University, a fellow at the Windsor Leadership Trust, and the co-chair of the editorial board for CAIS. So please welcome our panel led by Professor Aman Rajan.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this panel. Tarun mentioned his session as being a graveyard session, but I hope that this isn't one of them, because you all had an ice cream break, and I'm sure you all feel very energized. And what I'd like also to do is to make this session as interactive as possible. We want to have a conversation amongst the panelists here, but I'd also like to involve as many of you as possible. And if you don't raise your hands, I know quite a few in the audience, so I'll point a finger at you. To make sure that you're part of this discussion. Before I introduce our distinguished panelists, what I want to do is to say a couple of words about why client experience has become very important in asset management. Tony Carroll did his presentation this morning. He had one of the charts there, which was from a research report that KPMG and Create Research had done last year, which talked about the alternative investment industry moving into a new phase. And this transition was really sparked by digitization. We've got digitization sort of coming into every part of the value chain in alternative investment industry, to the extent that it is seen now as a source of improving investment performance, also as a source of delivering first-rate client experience, also as a source of improving operational excellence, and also as a source of delivering value for money. So it's a tall order. Digitization is able to deliver this. What we want to do now is to really explore how far we're down that particular route. In order to answer that question, I'm honored to introduce our panelists today. On my extreme right is Victoria Rock. She's a global head of alternatives at Legg Mason, a seasoned professional who has worked in alternative business as well as in the high net worth area. Next to me is Jeff Klein. He's the founding partner at Aptitude Investment Management. And as well as managing his firm, he helps his clients do asset allocation and construct long-term investment strategy. To my immediate left is Peter Charovich. He is the president of Corporate and Institutional Services at Northern Rock, a seasoned politician, a seasoned professional as well, having worked in client service organization for the best part of 25 years. And to my extreme left is James Waldinger. He's the CEO of Artivest, and he brings a wealth of experience in financial services innovations and so on. So welcome our panelists. And what I'd like to do is to really get a handle on this concept of client experience. This is a phrase which has crept into investment vernacular in the last 5 years or so. So Peter, can you just help us get our hands around this idea? To what extent this is rhetoric, to what extent this is reality? What do we mean by client experience?
Sure. I have to say, though, Northern Rock went bust in the UK, and I'm from, I work at Northern Trust. Okay, just to be clear, all right?
I'm glad you are awake.
Still gainfully employed. I thought about client experience, and I'm not sure how many people have walked through an Amazon Go store. But in Chicago the other day, I walked through the store, took my app, put it down, walked in, grabbed a bottle of water, walked out, 10 seconds, and little buzz on my phone as I'm walking away, and it told me what I paid, it took the money. And I said, wow, that was awesome, right? That's client experience. Now ask yourself, if you're a client and you're buying private equity, for example, or if you're a manager, all right, and you're distributing it, how many times has that, wow, this is really awesome, ever come up? It really hasn't, right? So for client experience in the alternatives world, in my view, take performance and put it aside. Everything else that we're talking about, How fast can you open an account? Right? What does the reporting look like? What's the AML KYC look like? What are the capital calls? How paper intensive? How many people have to touch it? How much is it email? All of that. And you realize that this industry, we're really on step 1 or 2 of trying to get to a client experience that people get every day in their normal lives.
Yeah. Victoria, if I can come to you, please. You know, when it comes to institutional clients and retail clients, obviously the experiences that one can give them are very different because we live in an age of disintermediation. You know, we don't have access to our clients on a scale that we would like to have. So, you know, how do we distinguish between institutional and retail clients here?
So I think what they're looking for is very different. So I think retail clients are really looking for a level of what we like to call customer intimacy. So just as Peter talked about his experience with Amazon, that's what we really need to emulate in the alternative investment industry, but we've obviously got a long way to go. As with respect to institutional investors, I think really what they're looking for is for asset managers and alternative investment providers to be able to provide them with tools that allow them to make better investment decisions. So whether it's analytical tools, risk tools that will allow them to analyze their existing portfolios and investments. So I think those are the two different tensions within the customer experience.
Yeah. Jeff, if I can bring you in now. Dan Daniela talked about you know, 2 things that he said that really sort of struck me. One of them was that a lot of growth is really going to come from high net worth individuals. And he also talked about the millennials. So we got 2 target groups here who are very digitally oriented. How far are we now in terms of serving the needs of these nascent groups?
Well, our focus is much more on the institutional groups, but in the high net worth world, I think we're in the very early stages of delivering the kind of experience and the service that they've come to expect, as Peter mentioned, in the rest of their lives. When we look at what these groups today are looking for, they want engagement on the issues that are important to them. So there's been mention of ESG and finding investments that not only meet their performance expectations and their risk expectations, but also align with their value systems. And that really comes back to something that I think is important both for institutional investors and high net worth investors, which is really understanding the investment beliefs of your clients and the basis of those beliefs, and making sure that the solutions you're providing align with that belief set and are consistent with that belief set.
Yeah. How far are we in terms of aligning ourselves with those beliefs as an industry?
Well, I think as an industry, we still largely have a product focus, and we are still largely delivering products to our clients, whereas clients really want us to have more of a solutions or an outcomes focused. And therefore, I think we've got a long way to go. I think the starting point is ensuring, once again, that you understand the underlying beliefs, and you go through a process of matching client beliefs with your investing beliefs as a provider, to ensure that there's some alignment there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. James, if I can bring you in now, please. To what extent is this disintermediation a major barrier to improving client experience?
It's a great question. And I'll speak on behalf of what I've learned from founding and running Artivest, which is a digital platform focused really on connecting the high net worth individual investor as opposed to the institutional investor with fund managers. To the question of disintermediation, I'd say there is a great role that digitization has to play in terms of creating access points for investors and scale for money managers or fund managers.
Yeah.
But if you are resisting digitization because you're worried about disintermediation, I would suggest that you think again. And the reason I'm saying that is because generally speaking, if you're looking to enhance your client's experience, and as you pointed out, as Dan was just indicating to us, the retail investor is quickly becoming, or the high net worth, the largest segment of investor in the alternative population of funds. if what you want to do is raise from that community, you need to have a scaled digital way of communicating with those clients, of helping them understand what they're invested in, of helping them understand everything from what is a capital call to how do I think about a Sharpe ratio, clients who are sophisticated individuals suitable for the investment, but not necessarily financial professionals. In order to do that, it costs money, it takes time and effort, and most firms out there don't have the wherewithal nor the interest, frankly, in building out an entire team of folks to go out and conquer the space. Therefore, what we're seeing is more and more fund managers are outsourcing it to folks like an Artivest or others like us, tech providers who can digitize the client experience. They're worried, let's be clear, they're worried that the individual investor will come to, let's say, us, in order to get into a fund from a KKR or a Carlyle or a Millennium or a Renaissance or whatnot. They're worried that we won't necessarily represent their brand well enough. So the advice that we give is kick the tires before you choose an outsourced provider. Make sure you find out, do clients have a good experience? Make sure that the outsourced provider is willing to represent your brand and help you learn and engage with this new client lens. But the best ones out there, I would say, are not really disintermediating. The only thing they're actually taking away is the extra friction and the extra cost that it would create for you if you tried to do it yourself.
Yeah. If I can come back to you, Vito, at Northern Trust, you've got a big wealth management business. What sort of tools are you providing your clients in terms of improving their experiences?
Yeah, so I'm going to give them a plug, and we actually go with our friends here as well. So I would say two things. One is back to the risk and all the controls and all those things. We do holistic advice, and a lot of people do goals-based investing. We do that, but look at everything around their life in terms of insurance, the whole 9 yards. That being said, if we look at the hedge funds and the private equity investments, right, it's not that much. We have to go out and get someone that's really focused on that, because the scale we have for the amount of investment that goes in there is not worth the amount of dollars you need to put into creating that digitization. So until you get big enough where you can say, okay, this many billions is going to be going into that, you might not have the scale to build the platform yourself. So how do you create an ecosystem and create partnerships to get that done?
Yeah. And coming back to you again, James, you sort of mentioned that what you want to do is to really have, if I can call it, a non-financial alignment of interest, whereby you really share investment beliefs with your clients. You also share time horizons with them, because there is a lot of evidence which basically shows that unless there is that non-alignment of interest present, clients always end up doing the wrong thing at the wrong time. And how do you promote that non-financial alignment of interest?
Well, I think it starts with the very beginning of the relationship. If you, as a provider, have a very clear set of investment beliefs, and you actually display those beliefs for all to see in your materials, in your conversations, in your discussions with prospects, ultimately they will make the choice as to whether those investment beliefs fit with what they think is an appropriate way to invest. And so it really starts with documenting those beliefs and really espousing them consistently across the various distribution platforms that you have, so that they are very clearly understood.
Your thoughts on establishing that non-alignment of interest, Victoria?
I think we try to work, we don't have retail clients directly. We work with our intermediary partners to try and understand what their clients are looking for. And so what we like to think about is really doing what we call client-led product development, which is where we work with our partners to understand their specific client needs and to develop solutions and outcomes that meet their needs.
Your thoughts, James? Non-financial alignment of interest?
Yep. What I find fascinating about the alternative investment space is how far away it is from everyone else in financial services when it comes to digitization. Once you bring alt investing into a digital world, once you take your LPs, put them through an online system for AML KYC or for suitability, you have a whole lot of information whereby you can understand who those folks are and what they're generally looking for and what their demographics are, based on their behavior online, based on their behavior engaging with you as a fund, and you can therefore best understand how to find those who best align with you. One thing that we're finding a lot is that folks will use digital tools in order to raise capital for a fund, and then they'll learn a lot from the data that they get about what types of clients are most interested in us that we might not have even realized. Thus, for the next fund they raise, they might shift to make sure they're aligning better with those clients.
Yeah. I'd quite like to open up the discussion at this stage to see if there are questions or observations from you folks in the audience. Philip, okay, gentleman here, behind Philip. Can we have the microphone here, please?
Peter, you raised a good point about the wall moment going into an Amazon Go and you pick up.
So there's a microphone coming because we can't hear you usually.
Peter, you raised a good point about going into an Amazon store, picking up a bottle of water or juice or whatever, walking out, you have a sort of swish on your phone and you've checked out and paid. Painless transaction, very quick, good customer experience. Unfortunately, that's not, certainly in the offshore world, that's not possible because of all the requirements for CRS tax reporting. So if your client invests through an entity, there is a 15-page entity self-certification form to complete. There's all the AML obligations, which the regulator, if you don't have a up-to-date passport and utility bill for the client, the regulator's going to be all over you. It's not quick and painless. So I think it's a bit of a dream, really, to get to that point. So I'd like you to address that.
Yeah, simple. You heard the last session or 2 sessions ago about autonomous cars. If we were here 10 years ago, would that be a dream? How hard is it to automate a 13-page form? And the issue is the business case to spend all the money when you only have a certain number of institutional clients who are going to buy it never stacks up to actually putting the infrastructure into automating these things. But as the technology costs decrease and you can get quicker to market, you'll see a lot of these individual processes being automated and being standardized and even mass customized because the data from one country is similar to another, and you can do this. But it will happen over time, absolutely going that direction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Perhaps if I could
sure.
raise a kind of related question, which is, I think one of the dangers of digitization is changing the expectations of investors and changing the timeframes. And digitization has, in many areas, driven more shorter-term gratification of wants and desires. And that's something that, particularly in the alternative investment world, we typically have longer time horizons, and those are often time horizons that protect us in a ways from ourselves. And so the flow of more shorter-term data, more shorter-term information, in many parts of the process, in terms of dealing with forms and dealing with KYC and all of those issues, may be a real positive. But if it flows across the entire system, I think it's fraught with some dangers as well and needs to be applied very carefully.
I think maybe a point that I think is very important is that actually we need to, as we have more retail investors coming and investing in alternative investments, we need to do a lot more around education. And I think, as we start to build out a more digitized customer experience, hopefully that can be a part of it, and really focusing on the fact that you do need a longer term horizon for these types of investments, and getting, I think it's easier to do it with a younger cohort of investors to really try to get them to think much longer term in terms of their horizons. And I think there's been a big shift, there will be a big shift from, effectively we're putting investment decision making on a group of individuals who previously didn't have to do that. If you were in a defined benefit pension plan, that was being done for you by a professional investor. Now we're putting it on to retail investors, and we need to equip them and make sure that we can help them to make the right decisions.
Yeah. To what extent the new generation of client service platforms provide good educational tools to investors in order to raise their level of financial literacy?
I mean, I think that's, at the moment it's more focused around what are the operational improvements and efficiencies, but I think that's where we need to go, and I think it will happen. So, you know, if you see what's happened really at the moment, it's more focused on the private banks not wanting to really have to do this stuff in-house anymore, so they go, right, let's get rid of this bit of our business. It's always been a big headache, and I know because I used to run one. And so let's digitize it, make a better customer experience. But the next part is, you know, and the private banks have a lot of resources themselves where they educate their clients. But when you move into a totally different, you know, more into the accredited investor world, then we really need to do that. And I think that's incumbent on the industry to make it part of what we do going forward, and maybe, you know, firms like James's and others can help us with that.
Yeah. Talking about that, if we extend the notion of alignment of interest and really sort of focus on financial alignment of interest, what kind of changes are we seeing in the fee models? Because one reads in the papers every day that, you know, there's a lot of fee compression occurring, and we also have huge investors like the government pension fund in Japan, you know, setting out a paper in very blunt terms saying, you know, what are the fees that they're going to accept and what kind of attribution analysis they're going to accept and so on. Mm-hmm. So are you sort of seeing those kind of changes more widely?
Yeah, so there's three trends going on right now. One is the regulators are getting involved in terms of actually looking at fee constructs. You know, some are talking about forcing clawbacks, different how long, how many years fees should go over, et cetera. Number two, clients just want to pay less. To some of them, it's a religious debate. They refuse, even in a long-only fund, I'm not paying 65 basis points. You're fired unless you're down to 40 or 30. So it's that debate. And the third thing, which is ironic and juxtaposed against this, is people will pay for performance. So if you have good performance, people will pay. And it's those three things that are bashing together that are creating, I see, very unique and different fee structures as clients and managers try to figure out how to make everybody have a good experience.
Yeah. And what sort of structures are likely to emerge, James, do you think?
Sure. I'm seeing more and more out there, and I expect this will continue, of performance increases and management fee decreases, so that it's a much closer experience between the client and the investor, in that the investor's not making any money off the client unless they actually generate appropriate returns. Sometimes that means it's like a 0.25 or 0.30 structure. Sometimes that means there's a hurdle before the fund manager gets paid themselves. One thing I wanted to add in there, though, about the question of fees and clients is that what we're seeing is that clients are focused a lot on fees. As Peter said, though, they will pay for performance. What we're finding, though, is that investment managers are confusing two concepts. One is the demand for transparency, and what oftentimes we see is that fund managers don't realize that transparency doesn't mean honesty. Transparency doesn't mean understanding. Transparency doesn't mean your client gets it. So we find that fund managers will often have counsel that force them to disclose every possible thing that could go wrong. Nothing's particularly highlighted. It's just boilerplate. Then investors are shocked when they learn that they had no idea about certain terms, because who reads all those documents? And so one thing that we guide the fund managers that we work with on, and that I think the industry should adopt, is education that ties to their actual product. So it's not just education about what does PE or hedge fund do, what does it mean, but it's education about the actual, what literally are we investing in? How should you think about the risks? Kind of put that out there, put a summary out there, because you know people aren't reading the whole thing. The more you're able to do that in an honest way and express what the real risks are, such that your client, whether they're institutional, retail, or financial advisor, really understands your process, what we find is the less complaining you'll hear if it doesn't pan out perfectly.
Yeah. The pension consultancy, Mercer, you know, they in one of their recent reports, they made the point that those are the sort of things that you mentioned, that those sort of things should be happening, but they're not happening at the moment. And so they've come out with a very extreme suggestion, which basically sort of says that asset managers should pay their clients for the privilege of managing their money. So there will be a fixed fee given to the client, and then there would be also a guaranteed return offered to the client. And once that guaranteed return has been delivered, the asset manager can keep the rest of the profit on that particular fund. Is this a very far-fetched idea?
So no upside.
I'm not sure I'd want to underwrite that.
I mean, I can see the attractiveness to the client, but you know,
It certainly made
I
headlines.
think we'd have to totally reinvent the industry to be able to accommodate that. And hopefully, it's a little bit far-fetched for now, but you know, maybe I can see a model where you can get maybe a different kind of alignment coming in. You know, as we try to tap into a different generation of investors, I think what they're going to want from their asset managers is going to be very different, and maybe they'll want things other than fees in terms of, you know, positive outcomes for investors. So maybe that's a different way to think about it.
James, your thought about the Mercer proposal?
I don't think I see the viability of that model, but there is a not too different model that has been in place for a long time that is slowly being accepted more generally by the institutional community, and that is the pass-through model, where a manager is effectively paid for the costs of running the business, of keeping the lights on, and then they get a performance fee over and above for generating returns that more than cover the cost of that basic fee. And so the pass-through model is one that historically was unpopular with institutional investors, but they seem to have got more comfortable that as a model that is more aligned with a manager that is then therefore incented to generating excess alpha-type returns over and above the cost of running the business. Obviously, it has to be applied in the right form with the right forms of alignment around it.
Yeah. Any questions on financial alignment of interest? Philip, can I draw you in, please? Can we have a microphone here, please? Philip,
Right there.
there.
There was a
Can you
question.
put your hand?
It's the
Philip,
largest
are you
microphone I've ever had, actually. I did have a question. I mean, this so far has concentrated significantly upon the client experience from the point of view of the execution and the implementation. I completely agree with you, Victoria. There's still a huge amount to be done in terms of education, helping customers understand. So all those things take it. The one area we haven't so much discussed is the design of the strategies themselves and how we source ideas. So how we innovate in the sense of perhaps this is connected with the question about data and how you are then able over time to identify with some of the trends that we are seeing in different areas, to identify quicker where there are opportunities for clients to make money, and also where there are areas where, frankly, it doesn't make sense to do so. And that's the area I just wished, if that's okay, that the panel could also comment upon.
James?
Absolutely. What we're finding from that perspective is that it's a great question. There's a whole lot of interest on the part of clients, especially the retail client or the high net worth retail client, but also institutions, for some of the more innovative structures we've seen lately, whether that be an interval fund or a private BDC or a non-traded REIT instead of a real estate private equity fund that has more liquidity. The way to, and to your point, the way that we work on it is, since everything's digital, we're able to see what our clients most interested in, and you don't need to be a rocket scientist to figure out where are there trends in the data. If you have funds that you're offering and no one's clicking on them and they all happen to be 12-year lockups or more, but everything that sells is a 7-year lockup or less, then there's your answer. And so what we're finding is that if you can, unfortunately though, if you just go out and survey clients, whether they're institutional or retail, what we've found, and I think a lot of people are nodding their heads, is that clients will respond in a way that is almost negatively correlated with what they end up actually doing. But unfortunately, it's not. It's more of a zero. So surveying doesn't work. Actual data does work. And using that data, we've seen that clients are really want that, especially the accredited folks or the folks who want more liquidity, really want that intermediary piece, not the mutual funds necessarily, not the private 10-year lockups necessarily, but a lot of kind of in between.
Looks like we've been bitten by the clock. So what I'd like to do is to draw this to the close. And before I do that, what I'd like to do is to sort of ask each of you, starting with you, Victoria, and then coming to you, Jeff. What's your thought for the day? You know, what do you really see coming in the pipeline 5 years from now?
So, I mean, I think the key thing, I think, is that we'll see more investments that are more focused on positive impact outcome for both clients and the community.
Positive outcomes, yeah. Jeff?
I think, as has been the theme of this conference, having a very good awareness of the evolution of application of digital technology data into the world of investing is going to be key. But I think at the same time applying a healthy skepticism to it, because the real success of those approaches has been where you've got very vast amounts of data and very systematic ways of making decisions. And that doesn't always apply in the investing world. So I think skepticism is warranted.
Okay. Peter?
If you listen to the morning, I think the digitization allows us to go from a product-centric world to a client-centric world. And that's a major shift. As a custodian administrator, everything's by fund, by legal entity, not by client. They got to give me AML for every single thing they buy, right? It's crazy. That whole thing will shift on its end, I think.
Yeah.
Looking 5 years ahead, I'd say everyone becomes a tech company. We're all tech companies.
Well, on that note, I'd like to bring this to an end. And could you please join me in expressing our appreciation to the panelists, please?
Thanks very much. So, final panel of the day before we hear and see Mr. David Blaine. It's really focused around a couple of themes we talked about here, millennialization of society, the rising interest of impact, the opportunities to really drive change and returns through investment. And we are approaching a revolution in solving some of the world's greatest problems. And it's really critical that our industry leads the way in the solutions, whilst also making a financial return for its investors. So we're delighted to have some of the leading panelists on impact investing with us today. So let me hand over to the chair, Julia LaRoche. She's a senior writer and on-air reporter with Yahoo Finance. Julia covers hedge funds, investment banks, private equity, and the C-suite for Yahoo Finance. And over her career, she's interviewed some of the world's most prominent investment managers and institutional investors. So with that, please welcome our final panel, led by Julia LaRoche.
All right, our final panel of the night, and it's about impact, which I understand has been a big theme here today, so I hope everyone's excited. And I would love to have my panelists here introduce themselves, tell everyone about who you are, what your firm does, what your area of focus is. I'm going to start with you, Anna Marie.
Sure. So I'm Anna Marie Washer, founder and CEO of Flat World Partners. We are an investment management firm that focuses on customized solutions for impact and sustainability across asset classes.
Terrific. Hi, my name's Asha Mehta. Thrilled to be here today. I work for a quantitative global equity firm called Acadian Asset Management. My role at Acadian is sort of wear multiple hats. One is I'm a portfolio manager, and the other one is I steward our responsible investing effort.
Good afternoon, Seth Blackman. I'm a partner with KPMG in the Bay Area. I head up our alternative investments platform, working with venture capital, hedge fund, and private equity folks, helping managers go from seed state operation to full-scale business. So I get to work with folks and see all their challenges across the entire growth cycle. So pleased to be here today, and thank you.
You know, one thing I really like about my panelists is that you all come at this from a different perspective. So I'm just curious, though, how did you get where you are today? What was your story? What was the aha moment to you getting involved in impact? Seth, let's start with you.
You know, I think it's for me, from an impact, it's always about making a change in people's lives. And we were talking before the panel that it's not about having doing what I want to do. My success in life is derived from helping others. And that passion to see people be successful and see them grow and see them achieve opportunities that they may not otherwise be afforded is what gives me my own career satisfaction and gratification.
And you, Asha?
Yeah, thanks. I'll try to keep it brief. I realize we're opening up for David Blaine, and it's sort of a career high in terms of where we are. But sure. So like I said, I wear multiple hats at Acadian, and I came to the firm, like I said, in the context of a portfolio management. So I think of my firm and my approach as really grounded in traditional fundamentals. Really, I see our objective as investors as maximizing risk-adjusted returns for our clients. I think it goes without saying, and again, given how much ESG and impact has come up throughout the day, it's just abundantly clear that in order to make a good investment, or to have a strong investment process, you have to think holistically about the companies you're investing in. And ultimately, that includes not only traditional financial statement analysis, but again, think about the broader issues that are impacting businesses and companies we're investing in. So I came at this really through that lens. It was about 10 years ago when some of our clients, particularly those out in Europe and Australia, which tend to be somewhat more progressive on issues related to ESG and impact, they came to us and asked us what we thought about what's called the UN PRI, the Principles for Responsible Investing. Asked us what we thought about it and if we'd be willing to become signatories. And as we got to understand what they stood for, we again recognized that they simply stand for implementing a broad perspective when investing. So thinking about not just the financial statements, but other sort of exogenous or externalities that can impact investments. So that's kind of how I came to it. And as I've been here, I've really come to realize that this industry is shifting. I think the panel is kind of aptly called the impact revolution, where it's certainly about ESG integration, taking ESG concepts and evaluating businesses along these measures. But I think we are sort of midway through this revolution about not only assessing how will companies impact our portfolios, but how can we use the capital in our portfolios to impact companies. So delighted for the panel.
Yep. And Anna Marie, you have an interesting story as well, how you came into this world.
Yeah, so I started making investments with my father when I was about 15 years old. We started doing biotech investing in Israel. And after university, I went on and started working in investment banking in London, and the financial crisis hit. And I was on my banking jobs, young analyst, and told everyone that they needed to do impact investing, because I'd read Banker to the Poor, Muhammad Yunus's book on microfinance. And the interesting thing about impact investing, about what happened during 2008, was that actual impact investors that were invested in mortgage-backed securities, their portfolios still performed during the crisis because they understood who they were underwriting those mortgages to, and they had training programs on education for financing. And I think that's what was misunderstood around impact investing. The other thing that happened that was more personal was that my father was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, and that really hit me hard because I suddenly realized that there was an ownership of understanding everything about finance. And as I looked around for advisors or investment management teams, whether it was fund managers or advisors, they weren't providing the transparency or partnership that I was looking for. And I felt like every time I gave my money over to someone else, or I saw asset managers that I was working with, all of a sudden it became their money. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that was where the world was going. I felt as though the next generation wanted transparency, they wanted innovation, and they wanted truly an alignment to how their money was being deployed. And that did not mean they wanted lower returns. In fact, they wanted higher returns because they are competing in a very quickly changing world, and the expectations upon that generation are significantly different, right? You didn't have to go to the library and go through the Dewey Decimal System anymore. Mm-hmm. You had to log into Google and be able to cite all the different references and under what format that reference had to be. So for me, the goal for Flat World Partner was to reinvent the investment management model and to provide true transparency that I thought impact investing really delivered, because you were aligning not just the client's capital to risk return, but also to their social goals.
Well, let's dig in more on that. Let's talk about doing due diligence.
Yeah.
I know you use data when you do it. Anna Marie, though, I want to dig in with you more on this because you have some different ways of looking at investments, whether it's venture capital or in the public space. So talk to us about your due diligence process.
Sure. So our due diligence process is as rigorous as any institutional investor. Our team came out of groups like OMERS or Cambridge or Credit Suisse. And what we quickly realized is that impact is a different type of due diligence that's required, and it's understanding not just the purpose or the success factors of those investments, but also how the manager thinks about it and implements it into the investment process. So on our venture program, we invest directly in companies and VC managers, but we're looking for systemic change and companies that will create positive social systemic change. So most people here would all say that Tesla is an impact company, despite the governance issues within the organization. But from the environmental factors, electric vehicles, way of the future. But how many Tesla cars are actually on the road, right? How much percentage of rideshare do they have? And so as we started to think about smart cities, electric vehicles, EV infrastructure without taking on the risk of those technologies, we suddenly realized that Lyft and Uber were going to be the largest car companies of the future. And then we analyzed Lyft and Uber and other ride-sharing companies, and we started to speak to their management team, and we thought, this was probably 4 years ago, we thought, wow, Uber's really not a good company. And then we talked to Lyft, and we said, you know what? Lyft has a partnership with GM to do electric vehicles. Their goal is to create carbon neutral rides, and they will eventually convert all electric vehicles on the road. They didn't have predatory lending practices for their drivers. In fact, they partnered with Hertz to create a program for people that couldn't afford to have cars to create secondary income. And every time I got in a car and spoke to a Lyft or Uber driver, they loved Lyft, hated Uber. Still do today. Ask most drivers.
It's true. Actually, I asked a driver that yesterday.
Yeah.
So Seth, I want to ask you, what are you hearing from clients when it comes to this sort of impact investing? Are you getting that interest from them?
You know what I think is interesting as a overlay to what you were just mentioning is the concept of impact investing and trying to have a greater purpose and get to, as Tony was mentioning this morning, the millennialization and beyond the what, getting to the why, which I think is a really great concept. At the end of the day, if there's no product, there's no point or there's no way for investors to get to the why in many cases, unless they're coming at it from a permanent capital perspective. So if there's someone who's made their money and they're allocating a pool of capital or resources into a topic or a strategy where they say, we want to go provide for a greater social cause or advancement of an initiative, and I think that that's a much easier path forward for that investment vehicle. When you're talking to allocators that are trying to build a successful investment product, they're looking at the entire landscape of opportunities, and to the extent that it does fit into an ESG sleeve, outstanding. Or if they need to carve out certain stocks or certain investments that their investor doesn't want to have within their portfolio, a lot of fund managers can customize a portfolio for such investor. But what I think has been more difficult is truly dedicated funds that have tried to differentiate based on that strategy. And they've had a more difficult time because you're ultimately limiting the number of investments that they can potentially craft in their portfolio to have a successful product. So I agree and aspire to a world where ESG investments perform better, but I think that in a world where we're all metriced, the product has to be there first. Then you can have the added benefit of we have a great portfolio, it has ESG components, and we're looking for new investors. And if you don't have the great product and you check all the ESG boxes, you're not going to have a viable long-term business.
But aren't we starting to see the power of the millennials? There's going to be this big wealth transfer. Look at what happened with BlackRock when a lot of young people were upset about some of the investments and some of their funds that were in gun stocks. So are you starting to see the power of the millennial generation as they start to have money to put to work?
I guess I'll answer briefly, then I'll kick it to Asha.
Yeah.
to the extent that they can check the QP in the accredited investor box, potentially, but they're still a few years, some of them are still a few years away from that.
Well, Asha, how about using data?
Yeah, I'll just sort of segue from what Seth was just saying, a couple things. One, I certainly agree that the product comes first, or said differently and sort of consistent with how Anna had presented this, that ultimately as an ESG investor or an impact investor, for this to scale, for this industry to take off, and I think there's tremendous momentum, the objective has to remain performance. I think performance is critical, as Seth was saying as well, in order to continue to maintain the garnering of assets. And from a first principle perspective, it should. Sort of as I mentioned before, ESG is simply a helpful framework to think about a heterogeneous set of non-financial issues. And maybe from here, I'll segue to your question, Julia.
Well, actually, we can get to that in a second, because I am interested in performance. And what is the track record? What does the track record look like for impact investing? And is this a whole myth that you can do well, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you'll do good? I mean, or do good, and it's not, I got that backwards, but you can do good and do well at the same time. There's this myth that you can't.
What I think part of the reason why I enjoy working in a quantitative investment framework is because these themes can be back tested. And so when we have a signal that we implement in our models and that we're investing capital on, we have conviction that these signals work. And this is very consistent with all the traditional factors you might think of. So valuation, of course, value matters. You want to invest in companies that have good growth prospects. We know that companies with good growth profiles typically outperform. Quality matters. ESG is very much like that. If you can find the right signal, and that's a big if, there's a lot of noise in the data. I think this came up earlier. This is somewhat of a novel issue around materiality. If you look at the ESG data providers who are out there, all of them provide hundreds of indicators. They're clearly not all material. They're not all material in all sectors. They're not all uncorrelated with each other. But if you can find a signal that's based in first principles, we find that if you backtest it, you often can find positive performance results. ESG stands for environmental social governance. Sort of little known fact that when ESG came to be, the E and the S